Hello, everyone. As of the last few months, I have covered every full season of Big Brother Canada, and I've also ranked each of the casts based on the skill sets and the gameplay they displayed during their season, and how I think they would do on other seasons based on what they showed us in their seasons, and if their skills and gameplay is repeatable. And I also based it off of whether they were lucky or not, and all that jazz. I mentioned earlier that I was going to rank all the pre-jurors in one video, and that's what I'm going to do now. I didn't decide to include BBCAN 8 because, simply put, I didn't feel like it, and there's no official endpoint of the pre-jury, and it just wasn't a complete season. And I'm obviously not going to cover them all since there was nothing to discuss. So I'm going to rank them. Obviously, I have my 7 official tiers that I've displayed, but I've broken each of them down to other sub-tiers that I'm going to mention as I cover some of the people here. Obviously, the first tier that I'm going to discuss is the Abysmal tier, and clearly a decent amount of the features are going to be here. The first subcategory is what I like to title Self-Destructive Disasters. So the first person here at 55th is Danielle from Big Brother Canada 1. So she was on the outs the entire time she was on, with the entire house, with the exception of Gary and somewhat Suzette from the very beginning. She had a turbulent relationship with Jillian over Emmett, volunteered to go on the block, thinking that it would gain her trust. Jillian was planning on targeting her anyways, but was initially swayed by Emmett. Did no campaigning to save herself, alienated herself from the house even more, and was blindsided out of the house. She didn't care to play the game whatsoever, was more focused on fame and romances, had poor social, strategic skills, and I just don't see her doing well on any season, due to all the reasons I've stated. At 54th place is Josh from BBCAN 9. He was on the outs from the very beginning, but had paranoid meltdowns a few days in the season, which diverted people away from him even more. He was supposed to be the first boot due to his behavior, but was spared due to reasons not in his control. He had poor read on the house, claiming that there's an all-boy alliance when all the boys were targeting one another. He thought that he was closer to more people than he actually was, when most of the house just called him delusional and were blatantly making fun of him. He was obsessed with causing chaos and was seen as an easy move for people. Has a poor social game and is very interpersonal, while having poor strategic reads and poor competition skills. Don't see him doing well for all the reasons mentioned above, and also being very paranoid. At 53rd place is Suzette from Big Brother Canada 1. So she was on the outs from the very beginning, and that never changed throughout her time in the house. Was lucky to win the first HOH based off a phone call, but targeted someone who was not coming after her in Cat and didn't use her HOH to form strategic or personal bonds with people to be protected. Initially targeted Tom and Emmett without having the support to do so as well. Was a dead woman walking in week 3, but was spared by a twist no one in the house knew about with the Canada's veto. Had several meltdowns and ranted about how people getting into showmans, people were rednecks, and people were being hoes, essentially. Gained an extra 2 weeks due to a twist and Gary winning HOH, but remained on the bottom of the house. Was sent home before jury solely because the house didn't want her in jury and just wanted an easy week. House felt like she gave pity parties to people for support and for game, which rubbed people the wrong way, but it wasn't even true. It was just her personality. She's not good at comps, poor socially, and struggles to get along with people in the house who are going to be younger than her in any cast. Don't see her doing well in any season. At 52nd place is Mackie from Big Brother Canada 7. He should be higher because he went home on a split vote. Was not the majority, or he wasn't in the majority the first week, but wasn't in the minority either. Was supposed to be an easy pawn, but actively did work that made him the target. Told people in the house, not only the HOH, but in the vote, that he was coming for them, didn't campaign whatsoever to save himself, and had no understanding of strategy and didn't care to have an understanding either. Had to be consistently trained by other people on what to say and do, and couldn't even do that successfully. Got a tie vote due to none of his own doing, but due to others using him. He would be higher, but actively did work to ruin his spot, and doesn't seem to have the awareness or ability to improve from his mistakes. He was good in competitions, but his abysmal strategy completely ruined his other strengths, and the inability to comprehend the basics of BB. At 51st place is Lavita from BBCAN 4. I did feel bad for how people treated her in the season, but overall, she's just a really abysmal player. She wins the first HOH, and people offer themselves to work with her, mainly Jared, and then puts up his romance Kelsey in the first week, without even putting him up, so it's you either nominate both or nominate neither. She isolated herself the entire week with Shari and ended up being blindsided with the vote. Ended up on the block in the second week due to these poor social bonds and Jared winning HOH. Stays because of nothing she ended up doing, and she wins HOH again. You would think she uses this to make amends with the house, strengthen some bonds, and learn from her horrible HOH. Nope! She yet again targets someone who wasn't targeting her, yet again isolates herself from most of the house, and yet again nominates a poor pawn, and yet again gets blindsided by the votes. She caught flack for an HOH that wasn't even hers, and was too much of a game bot for her supposed allies, which caused Mandy to prematurely send her home. In addition to that, no one voted her back in the house. We see here that she just repeats the same mistakes over and over again, and I can see her doing that in other seasons. The final person in the self-destructive disaster sub-tier is Paul at 50 from BBCAN 2. I don't feel like he truly got the strategies that are needed to do well in Big Brother in general. He came in with a plan to be a pot-stirring villain, but that's a tough strategy on its own, but it's even tougher to pull off as an older house guest and when you lack the charm to do so. He ended up winning the first HOH, but misused it horribly, as he was caught making several alliances, and the only thing he had by the end of the week were 2 allies with weak games. Easily got himself on the outs, especially after calling Andrew racist for supposed strategy reasons. Ended up staying due to nothing of his own doing, and became a pawn for Ica, when he was a horrible pawn, due to most of the house not liking him, and there's no Cal to keep him on the block safe against. Even the people who were pawning him, i.e. the girls, didn't have much intention on working with him. He had no regret for how he played the game and would probably play it again, so in addition to all of that, he probably doesn't do well on most seasons and justifies my ranking him in this spot. So the next sub-tier of Abysmal players are for people who I feel like were passive or were general outcasts who had no chance in Big Brother. So the first person in this sub-tier is Risha at BBCAN 3 at 49th. In some ways, she was definitely twist screwed, since there was no HOH like most first weeks, and she might have been kept safe depending on who won HOH, and she was also voted out by Canada instead of the house guests. At the same time, she ended up being nominated because she made a poor first impression on the house guests, and continued to not make a good impression. She found it hard to fit in with the cast and was seen as too big of a personality for them. Apparently, she made comments about Will's sexuality that also rubbed people the wrong way, and was going to be voted out by the house anyways if it was a normal vote. I don't see her doing well on virtually any season, though she isn't as strategically messy as some of the others from the little that we do see of her. At 48th place is Melina from BBCAN 10. We are going to have a string of first boots getting the boot here on this list. She was initially seen as the pawn, but a pawn that no one cared about booting first, and this mainly happened because she didn't speak to many people. We see her struggling to bond with people, and was too intrapersonal to do well in the game. Also gamed with the other nominee, and continued doing so knowing that it wasn't a good move. Just don't have any faith in her as a player, and see her doing poorly on most seasons. At 47th place is Laura from BBCAN 7. Another first boot on the list, and one of the more forgettable first boots in my opinion, just based on the fact that her season was a male-dominant one, meant that she already wasn't going to do very well, and the chances of that were low. I don't recall her having any sort of allies, but she was hyper-focused on Samantha, who was in a showmance with the HOH, and eventually Adam as well, which did her absolutely no favors. She admits that she cannot be fake in the house, and when something bothers her, she will vocalize it and lets it be known, which are fundamental flaws. The season was weird though, since there's no power of veto, so maybe she would have had a chance to save herself if there was a veto. I don't see her being as dead in the water on most seasons as some of the other first boots and other players in general below her, hence her being here, but I don't feel confident about her in general. At 46th is Nick from Big Brother Canada team. She was clearly cast to be an extremely quirky woman on her season, and it made her stand out in a negative way. It seemed like she didn't think or care much for the game, and she was mainly targeted due to her personality. It did not seem like she had any ally, so I see her doing poorly on most seasons. In general, she stood out like a sore thumb, and she couldn't tone it down even if she wanted to. There really isn't much to say about her, though she might have been the intended pawn for Paul when he made his initial nominations. At 45th is Rosina from Big Brother Canada 6. Another standard first boot who stood out like a sore thumb amongst the cast they were in, but unlike many of the others, she was affected by twists, since there was the heaven and hell twist that made half of the house safe, whoever was on the losing team had the option to be HOH, and there were only a few other people eligible to be nominated. It seemed like she just mentioned big moves and also rubbed Johnny the wrong way with how blatantly she was against him in the HH comp, so she didn't do herself any favors there. It seemed like the house guests actually liked her, which isn't usually the case for most first boots, but let's be real, she doesn't do well on most, if any, season she's on, so I have nowhere else but here to put her. At 44th is Christine from Big Brother Canada 4. With a season that had 3 sides of the house, and one of those sides being the self-declared floaters, Christine should have been in a prime position to do well. She mentioned that she actively took a step back and didn't play the game, which would be fine if she formed some solid relationships and especially got with the floaters, but that didn't happen. People in the house saw her as dry and miserable, in addition to seeing her as expendable, so it's not shocking when she was blindsided out of the house when Levita made her a poor pawn. Outside of being an older person, her attitude and passivity won't cause her to do well on most seasons. The final person in the sub-tier at 43rd is Vanessa from Big Brother Canada 11. She was never formally evicted and was pulled from the game, so we can give Vanessa that at least. In general, she had no alliances in the house, was consistently edged out of strategy talks, the girls didn't include her in their game talk or allegiances, and many of the guys wanted to actively target her. She got very emotional and paranoid, which caused her to go after Zach and poorly lied about her vote, which everyone knew about. At least she could have stayed a bit longer if she wasn't pulled from the game, but Vanessa isn't doing well on most BB seasons, was all over the place strategically and poor socially, and sticks out like a sore thumb too much. So the final sub-tier for the Abysmal tier is what I like to call the lack of or poor choices in allies, and the first person in this sub-tier at 42nd is Veronica. So she had the benefit of coming in after the first week and given immunity in the second week, rubbed people the wrong way just due to her sketchiness, her stories did not add up, and came off as very untrustworthy to many people in the house. Her strategies were poor and made no sense, like the hinky vote she threw, and then blatantly lying about it to the point that no one believed it, getting HOH-itis on an HOH that wasn't even hers, and her need for the house meetings and getting involved in stuff that has nothing to do with it is just a really poor trait. At least she had a few allies on her side, unlike many of the people below her, and while she's not dead in the water on most seasons, her irrational and nonsensicalness doesn't do her well on most seasons. So at 41st is Aika on Big Brother Canada 2. Based on her BBCAN 2 game, she was absolutely horrendous. From what it was portrayed, her attitude caused her to be nominated in the first week, but she was on pawn, wasn't in danger of going home, and that might have been an inaccurate edit anyways. But it was clear that she was on the out and never put in the work to get herself out of it. She was aligned with the catty girls, but when you are aligned with catty girls over being catty, you can't be shocked when the catty behavior backfires on you, which ends up happening here. She had people in the first 5 who were really mad at her and actively targeting her, where most of the house just didn't care about her. She won HOH and she had the chance to make other allegiances, target the people who were targeting her, and put herself in a better position, but she did everything she shouldn't do on an HOH. She alienated the few allies she did have on an HOH with picking fights, didn't target the people who were coming after her, put up 2 pawns, one of them being a horrible pawn, and the other one she was targeting due to personal reasons, and her target ended up staying in the house. Yikes. At 40th is Stephanie from Big Brother Canada 10. She seemingly knew what to do pertaining to the game, at least in the preseason, but it just didn't add up. She entered the game wanting to flirt with and manipulate some of the guys, but everyone saw through what she was doing. She didn't have the tact or social grace to pull it off. Apparently, she isolated herself with Jacelyn in the first week. A lot of the girls didn't care for her, and she was not included in the majority alliance, and the guys weren't biting either. Apparently, a lot of people wanted to target her entering the second week, and the only reason why Marty didn't target her that week was because of a deal they made. And of course, she was nominated by an ally on her final week in the house where he didn't even intend for her to go home. And because of his stupid actions and putting up an even more worthier pawn and ally to people, they ended up flipping the house on her. At 39th place is Shari from BBCAN 4. I know that she didn't play a good game, clearly, but before I rewatched BBCAN, I wasn't expecting her to be in the lowest tier. The main issue I have with her game is that she really isolated herself with Levita in the first week and got very comfortable once Levita won HOH, but it wasn't her HOH. She tied herself to the biggest target in the house and didn't even have solid allies on her side, where they would have much interest in keeping her or getting to know many of the other house guests in general. When she and Levita were on the outs, they had a very poor conversation with Kelsey, and she essentially lay down and died once she was on the block. People saw her as someone who had a lot of potential, but she made a lot of poor moves in the 2 weeks she was in the house, and I don't really see her improving in other environments or seasons. At 38th place is Andrew from BBCAN 6. He definitely played really poorly throughout his short time in the house, and while a part of it was due to the heaven and hell twist, which has brought a lot of attention on him, he didn't handle the situation the best way he could, and his actions caused him to be on the outs. He decided to campaign against Alejandra when the eviction was already set in stone, and apparently doing most of it the night before, when people already made their minds and used it as a reason to target him in the second week. He had really poor conversations with people during the second week of the season. The house was able to convince his close ally in Ryan to nominate him, and he just kind of waited out his eviction. He would probably stand out in a negative way on most seasons, and the social, in addition to the strategic strengths needed, aren't there, but partially went because his ally stupidly threw him under the bus. And the final person in the Abysmal tier is Kyle from BBCAN 2. A part of me thought that I put him very low on the list, and I was thinking that maybe I overreacted, but with time I realized that I really didn't. The house really disliked him from the very beginning, which is interesting since people in his archetype usually isn't hated, but it makes his poor social game stand out even more. It causes him to be on the out, and when week 2 came in, he, as well as Adele and Paul, picked fights with the entire house, and he ended up being backdoored, since he was more intimidating physically than Paul. While he was aware that he probably was going to be backdoored, he just didn't seem awful strategically compared to Adele and Paul, so people found him to be dangerous, and a lot of people found him to be extremely disingenuous and hard to get to know, which is a problem in a social game. The next tier we're going to move on to is the bad tier, and these are people who aren't good at the game whatsoever and would most likely not do well if they were to play many different times. And the first sub-tier of this tier are bad first boots, which is very self-explanatory. At 36th is Julie from BBCAN 9. From what we see, she's relatively active in the game, is gaming with people, and immediately makes an alliance with people like Austin, Brayden, and Victoria. At the same time, she was also seen as one of the weaker people on the team, and due to her being so messy, people like Latoya thought that Julie was a loudmouth liability, which Julie even admitted. We see Julie tell people about what Josh said when she should have just kept it quiet. Due to the twist of the first week, she probably wouldn't have been the first boot, and she was not the target for most of the week, hence her not being in the lowest tier, but I think her messiness would cause her to be an early boot more often than not. At 35th is the first boot ever in Kat from BBCAN 1. Her evictions is still relatively confusing since she was genuinely trying to help Suzette, but it freaked Suzette out and it ended up with Kat being nominated. But it shows that Kat's social cue and her social game wasn't great anyways. And from the episode, it didn't seem like she was a quick outcast, so that is going to be a problem if she's on most seasons, and her campaigning really wasn't good. She just seemed out of her depth on Big Brother. At 34th place is Paige from Big Brother Canada 4. At first, I did feel bad for her and thought she was somewhat robbed when her eviction happened in real time, but after 7 years and a recent rewatch, I don't feel that way anymore. It was clear that she was out of her element, despite being one of the bigger fans of in the season. She did not socialize with people over the first few days and was the last person to speak to the HOH, which not only made it easy for her to be nominated, but easy for the house guests to vote her out. Even in her intro package, she stated some things that were blatant oxymorons or contradictory to one another, and it seemed like she didn't know fully what she was doing. She did go in a split vote, but it wasn't due to her campaigning, but the others following what the HOH wanted. The final person in this sub-tier is John Michael from BBCAN 11. His strategy going into the season was being a competition beast, calling people out, and targeting all the guys, which all this just was never going to be a very attainable one, since, like Paige, it seemed like he wasn't capable of actually doing what he was talking about. He had a few shallow relationships and even fewer game relationships, so it was very easy for him to be thrown up, and while people did feel bad for him, no one really vouched to save him whatsoever. I don't see him doing well on most seasons, but he didn't play the worst, and it could be argued that he was somewhat screwed over due to someone he saw as a potential ally selling him out stupidly. The next sub-tier is for people who I consider to be sloppy or passive people without a strong infrastructure. The first person in this sub-tier is Cassandra from BBCAN 5. She isn't lower because she came in on a returning season where there's a lot of outside circumstances, like most of the alumni not liking BBCAN 4 and some of them specifically not liking her. Despite being in the quote-unquote Veterans Alliance, she mentioned in anger that she would backdoor Netta, she was not close to the BBCAN 3 crew at all, who she was actively targeting, Gary almost flipped on her over a misunderstanding, and the other veterans saw her as expendable. It didn't help that a lot of the newbies didn't care for her, and she couldn't form bombs with people because she was a game bot, and thought that her strategy from the prior season was okay and was a replicable one. She was able to get some people by the end of her stay, but it was too late and refused to adapt from her prior season, but was more obsessed with how social media would perceive her. At 31st is Eddie from BBCAN 7. He did not do a whole lot wrong, but he didn't do much right in the season either. He wanted to play under the radar, which is fine and all, but you need to form relationships, and he didn't really form bonds with most of the house guests. Some people did like him, but they never considered him to be an important ally, and when the pre-jury double eviction came, it was not shocking that he would be the one who was swiftly booted. I also think that due to cultural differences, and him just in general not being a very social person, I don't see him doing well on most BP seasons, and his strategy was mediocre at best with being under the radar, but even his reads on certain situations and people weren't the best either. At 30th is Emily from BBCAN 5. There really isn't much to say about her, though I should have more to say about her compared to the others, since she is a final pre-juror. She was close to Dylan and somewhat Dallas from the beginning, and they ended up on the outs when they voted incorrectly on the mark vote, but didn't have much allegiance to anyone else to overcome it. The supposed alliance she was in always preferred Dylan over her, so she was always going to be the first out. She was a poor strategist and a horrible campaigner, and a lot of the newbies just didn't care for her either. She was just an expendable pawn who wasn't meant to have longevity. At 29th is Dallas from BBCAN 5. He didn't do a whole lot wrong this time around, but he didn't do much right at all. There was a supposed Veterans Alliance made in the first week, but he was never really included in it, and they mentioned that he would never report back to them, which is why he ended up being in the position he was in, or one of the reasons. So not only is he not good with the veterans, but he also grouped himself with the unpopular newbies and ended up voting on the wrong side of the first vote. It made him a very easy target for the next week, and when he was on the block, he thought that throwing Dylan under the bus, who wasn't even nominated and didn't take part in his nomination, was the right move, but many of the house guests even saw that was fake. Or that's what they thought. At 28th is Kiara from BBCAN 7. It's one thing to be a bad player in the game, but it's another thing to be a bad player and an overconfident one as well, especially when it was just not warranted. She thought she knew so much, but really knew very little, and lied to act superior over most of the house. She had tunnel vision over Samantha, Adam, and Chelsea the entire season, even when they offered several olive branches to her, and she didn't pick up on the fact that one of her closest allies in Dane was untrustworthy when he voted the opposite of everyone else during the Mackie vote until it was too late. And unlike Estefania and Damien, Dane wasn't even protecting her hardcore, so she had a big target that caused her to be the first expendable person from the group. And with the way she revised history when she was out of the house, there clearly is a lack of self-reflection there that would cause her to do better if she were to ever return. At 27th is Austin from BBCAN 9. Her biggest issue in the season was that she was way too passive, and it caused the game to be played around her, to the point where she ended up on the outs for good. And what made things worse is that she actively ruined things, or she had the chance to do big things, as she was actually the first HOH, so she had a huge benefit that could have and should have centered the dynamics and strategy in her favor, but she didn't even do that. she got way too comfortable in the game and thought she was closer to the likes of Tashawn and Judson than she really was, and she didn't maintain her relationship with Victoria, which caused the latter to idiotically target her during the secret HOH. And even people like Tara and Tina, who she was supposedly aligned with, didn't feel comfortable around her and didn't know where her head was at, so that relationship weakened too. When she did choose her side, she chose the losing side and was one of the bigger targets on the losing side. The final person in this sub-tier at 26th is Miran. His entire run on the season is just really underwhelming. He was voted into the house on week 2 due to the Angels vs. Devils twist, so he was able to miss out on the first week and was given immunity during the second week. The house immediately doesn't trust him or Veronica and did not find him to be useful in any way. He eventually did choose a side, but it was the losing side. He became a pawn during the last few rounds of his time in the house and seemed like he was starting to somewhat integrate, especially with Derek and Kayla, but it was just way too late, and him integrating with them only made his target grow during his final week. He's just too passive in every facet, and I don't see him improving on most other seasons either. So the next sub-tier are people who have small upsides or not as many downsides. And the first person in this sub-tier is Greg from BBCAN 3 at 25th. I'm shocked he's this high since I don't think very highly of his game at all, but it makes sense when you're ranking people who didn't last long in BBCAN. Pros of his is that he was in a majority alliance for the entire time he was on the season called the Chop Shop, even though half of the people in that alliance didn't take it seriously, and they were for the most part protecting him, until they had no choice but to let him go. At the same time, he had an extremely obnoxious personality that rubbed most of the house the wrong way. It made him a huge target and was extremely pushy/anxious, which heightened his paranoia and made him paranoid. I don't see him playing well in any other seasons he was on, and I don't see him playing any other way, so he is here. At 24th is Jess from BBCAN 10. Another person I wasn't expecting to rank so highly on this list, especially how their journey was throughout their time on BBCAN. Jess rubbed people the wrong way initially and picked fights over the dumbest things, which helped them be the target on the first week, but won the clutch veto when their butts needed to be saved. After that, they slowly started making bonds with key players like Kevin, Marty, etc., and was even in an alliance with some of the girls, but Jess was always expendable, but it cost half of the house to want to keep them around. At the same time, they could never get the Hermans or the Mooses off their back, and when they got to power, it sealed Jess's fate, especially after they poorly ran their HOH right before this, and sent home Tanisha, who wasn't after them. At the same time, due to the bonds Jess created, they almost stayed against Gino, so there are some redeeming factors. At the same time, I don't see Jess improving on their game, skills, or learning from their mistakes if they played again. At 23rd is Dallas from BBCAN 4. I know a lot of people feel like his BBCAN 5 game is better than his BBCAN 4 game, and I somewhat see why people think that. I honestly thought the same thing before this rewatch. In the season, Dallas actually had a relatively solid alliance with Maddie and Ramsey, and had loose connections to Shari and Lavita and Paige. He was in a good spot before he blatantly lied about his vote during the first week, or he lied about his first week vote during the second week, and he was able to win 2 vetoes, though he did nothing with them other than building a larger target on its back. At the same time, he was loud, obnoxious, and rubbed the house guests the wrong way, and he cannot get his allies to make the right moves in not getting rid of Lavita, and he was all over the place strategically. He completely buried himself during his final week, and while he was close to staying, I don't know how much of that was his own doing. As we have seen, he isn't able to improve on his mistakes. The final person in this sub-tier at 22nd is Tom from BBCAN 1. Another one that I wasn't expecting to be this high, though he is still in the bad tier. Tom was able to get into an alliance with Emmett, Peter, and Alec called the Quattro, and they had control over the first few weeks. At the same time, he made the outsiders feel like crap, and they targeted him throughout his run, hence him being nominated the first week, where he probably goes home if the noms stayed the same. Strategically, he was extremely emotional, like targeting Suzette out of all people, and had to constantly be micromanaged by the likes of Liza and Emmett. Peter and Alec turned on him early because they didn't like him, and he ended up spilling his alliance to Liza. Don't think he's able to learn from his mistakes, so I think he would get booted around here on most seasons. And the final sub-tier is what I call the almost puts them in the higher tier. So at 21st from BBCAN 7 is Kaylin. She was definitely someone that surprised me when I rewatched the franchise overall, as I was expecting her to be much worse than she actually was. Kaylin's social game actually wasn't bad, and there were a lot of people that liked her, and a group of people who did want to work with her. It wasn't great, and she definitely had her fair share of enemies, hence why she ended up going home early, but I was expecting her to be very poor socially, which wasn't the case. She definitely had the strategic mind for the game, that makes her decent in that area, and it counts for people to unjustly see her as some sort of mastermind, especially after the failed flip vote for Mackie. In general, I do think she struggles on most seasons she's on just due to the generation gap, and her lying about her age was just really bad. At 20th from BBCAN 11 is Zach. I've made it very clear on how I don't think his game is good at all, and I don't think he has any potential to do better due to his lack of ability to take accountability, admit wrongdoing, and self-reflecting. He is higher than many of the others because he did have some control and influence, which he used in the first few weeks and rounds of the game. And a lot of people did genuinely want to work with him throughout the season. The issue is, he bulldozed his way to get what he wanted and was very open about it, which would obviously cause people who don't want to be bulldozed and want to control their own agency to put a stop to it, in addition to the people he burned by turning on allies for no reason to want to help in making his downfall happen. He has big move ideas and wants to make it known to people, which almost never works, and he can just never just relax and let a round play for himself and let his social game do the work for him. He underestimated people who weren't his allies, and when he was in danger, he completely crumbled with the stunt he pulled and eventually quitting because he was getting voted out. At 19th place is Andrew from BBCAN 2. He was obviously going to be on the higher end for a few reasons. One, he is a late pre-juror, so we just have a lot more information about him as a player compared to others who went earlier. And the second reason is that he was absolutely twist-screwed by Canada, where many of the non-first fivers admitted that they wouldn't have targeted him that week without the twist. He was able to get into a solid alliance that had a lot of influence in the game and was able to somewhat get along with the other guys while being good in competitions. At the same time, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way with his attitude and actions, even with some of his allies being annoyed by him. And while he was more focused strategically than Tom, in comparison, he still wasn't good strategically, and he was very entitled about his strategy and had no charm to convince people to do what he wanted. He probably makes it a bit further on most seasons, which is why he's a bit higher, but he just sulked when he was nominated. But it is different being nominated by your country instead of a house guest. And the final person in the bad tier overall, at 18th, is Hamza from BBCAN 6. Now we are at the final pre-juror in the bad tier, and he's in the top 20, where I've made it my thought on Hamza as a player very clear, especially with how manipulated and outright false the edit for him was. Strategically, he was so all over the place, and that's me putting it very nicely. He was campaigning for Rosina to stay, but didn't do it well enough and was sloppy with it, and aligned with people who were at the bottom of the house with Andrew and Ryan, causing him to be nominated in the second week. He did win the HOH in the third week, and we did see him start making good relationships with people in the white room, so I think he was genuinely improving as a social player, even with Erica, who was in the red room. He was easily convinced by Derek and Kayla to not target him, despite all the mouth he had against them in the earlier weeks, and targeted Jesse for personal reasons, where the edit made it seem like it was a mastermind move. He kept on mentioning that he was causing chaos for no reason, and I really did nothing, but he did align with the losing side, and was backdoored by Olivia, whom he had no relationship with whatsoever. But a lot of people were very sad about his eviction, which says something about him in a good way, I guess. Now we are moving on to the potential tier, and these are people who I think could do well if they're on other seasons, but they're just very inconsistent or we don't have enough information. They're not bad players, they're not mediocre players, and they're not solid players, so they're kind of in this gray area. So like the other tiers, I'm creating sub-tiers, and the first one is what I like to call borderline middling. The first person in this tier at 17th is Anil from BBCAN 1. He came in the era of BBCAN where there were a lot of contrived superfans who were trying to be like Dan and Will, and he did it poorer than most, hence his early boot in the season. It did not seem like he had many allies, and with the Quattro Alliance gunning for him in the beginning, especially Emmett, he thought he was much closer to Julian than he was, and the likes of Suzette and Gary outright disliked him. Many of the house guests immediately distrusted him and saw through his tactics immediately, which was why he ended up on the block in the second week. It did seem like he was starting to slowly integrate himself within the likes of Liza and even the Shield, where he could have done some damage. He is on this tier because he was too skewed by the secret veto that had to be used, where he would have lasted longer, and who knows how much longer he would have ended up lasting. I don't know if he would do the same tryhard stuff in other seasons that he did in this season, though. At 16th is Liza from BBCAN 1. Now that my review of BBCAN 1 in general is more distant, I might have put her a bit too high, especially since she is messy as hell online and has gotten into several online feuds. Strategically, she actually wasn't bad at all. She knew that Emmett was running the season and was full of shit, and she knew that Time was hiding a secret alliance from her. She knew that playing with the girls and guys was a good idea, but she was just sloppy with it. Competition-wise, she wasn't good, and she vastly overrated her social game, though I don't think it was that bad. When it comes to the game, it seemed like she had some awareness, but her messy personality is always going to be an issue. I can see her doing well in some other seasons, but I can also see her replicating this season on others as well. At 15th place is Jay from BBCAN 10. They are such a weird person to talk about now that I'm comparing them to all of the pre-jurors on this list. From what we saw and heard about in the first week, Jay was not in a serious alliance or really in an alliance in general, but we saw that they had close ties to Summer, Betty, Josh, Jess, and other relationships, where entering week 2, no one else but Marty was targeting them, and that only happened because Marty made a deal with Stephanie. It seemed like Jay had a chance to survive the week against JC Lynn, but she won the veto and Betty was nominated, so Jay was done. Strategically, there isn't much to discuss, but I do think that Jay was pretty good socially, and I see them doing well on other seasons if they're randomly placed in one, a la a Brayden or even a Gary run. The final person in the sub tier is Kyle from BBCAN 9 at 14th place. He is definitely one of the more forgettable people, not only on BBCAN 9, but in BBCAN in general, and it's clear why he was initially an alternate. He was able to get into and create a solid alliance with half of the house that needed to align with one another, and he was less sloppy than Rohan in comparison. Kyle was seemingly one of the more stabilizing forces in the alliance and in the season in general, but with the way he played and how he created a sides versus sides angle and weaker relationships with people not unassigned, he was bound to be targeted. I can see him doing well in some other seasons and more stable seasons, but he just made less mistakes than most of the others that are pre-jurors. The next sub-tier that I have is what I like to call some slight issues socially, and at 13th is Neha from BBCAN 3. One of the reasons why she ended up making it this high, especially compared to many of the others, is because she was blatantly twist-screwed. She was booted in the third and final instant eviction ever, but in this version, Kevin had to make his nominations immediately, and then speaking to the other house guests, unlike the other two, where they were just sequestered for a while and then made their nominations. Under the assumption of it being a normal HOH, Neha was able to get Zach and Jordan on her side, and was able to somewhat talk Kevin into their beliefs, so it showed that Neha had a lot of potential to do strategic damage. She was able to have a lot of alliances in her short time in the house. BBCAN 3 was a mess regarding everyone having several alliances, and she did have loyal allies in the house, like Sarah, Brittany, and Johnny. But her social game with some others was pretty weak because she had the resting bitch face and cannot fake being interested in other people when she wasn't. At 12th place is Mark from Big Brother Canada 5. It's a shame that out of almost 60 pre-jurors, a first boot ended up beating roughly around 50 of them, but when you look at Mark, it does make sense. He was on a returnee season, which instantly slants things against the newbie's favor, which we've seen in BBUS time and time again. Even with that, most of the veterans wanted to keep him around and actively worked to keep him around, to the point where he was booted in a split vote instead of the intended, almost unanimous vote. Apparently, he did some active work into having a poor relationship with Karen, but most of the newbies didn't even want to target the big strong guys, when it's rare for them to be nearly booted first anyways. I feel like he does well on most seasons, and did pretty good in the few comps he was in, though I don't know how he would have progressed strategically. At 11th place is Johnny from BBCAN 3. He is one of the more forgettable people in BBCAN history in my opinion. He didn't have a dramatic pre-jury fall, he was not in the majority alliance at any point in time, he didn't get into much drama, and his departure didn't really affect the season at all. Johnny definitely had a strategic mind, where he was cool with the girls and was trying to make bonds with some of the guys. There were a lot of nerdy guys in the season, so that helped him. But things just did not come together for him. It seemed like he was a bit too close to Neha, and the other connections he was trying to build, like with Kevin, always saw him as extremely expendable. He was pretty solid in competitions from what I remembered, and I could see him doing well in some other seasons, but also doing pretty poorly in some seasons as well. In general, he just made a lot less mistakes than most of the other Pre-Jurors, hence his placement. The final person in this sub-tier, and the first person to make it to the top 10, is Gary from BBCAN 5. So, Gary's run in BBCAN 5 is definitely an interesting one, and I am definitely more lenient on him because of all the preseason drama that affected his run during the season. The first thing is that Gary was not close to many, if any, of the veterans that were put on the season with him. I think Emmett not being on the season due to contractual reasons really hurt him in this regard, and he isn't close with many alumni either. There was also the sideshow wardrobe drama that happened with him and Neda, which he apparently started, and the two of them never got over it. In the season, he definitely went out of his way to be more social and wanted to be a strategic advisor for the newbies, which I do think is a smart strategy. He unknowingly started the downfall of Cassandra, which weakened his position, and he didn't realize that he was running out of numbers until it was too late. But he was taken out due to the stupid backwards week, where if the result of the competitions of that week was still the same, he wouldn't have been in danger at all, based on who won HOH. And the final sub-tier in this tier is what I call question mark, and these was for people who had some very weird evasions that they had very little fault in. And the first person in this tier at 9th is Chelsea from BBCAN 7. She's one of the weirder ones to talk about in general pertaining Big Brother Canada. It seemed like she was doing well, and she had a good relationship with Kyra, Samantha, and Adam, while the other pretty boys did like her during the first few weeks, as they all voted to save Kira in week 2. But things definitely went downhill when she won in HOH, though she probably shouldn't have won it, and targeted Kaylin, who wasn't thinking of her and wasn't a threat, while overestimating her relationships in the house. It seemed like she had the right idea strategically more often than not, and tried to have relationships with everyone in the house, but Adam unfortunately was playing for the guys to win and not in his best interest, so he sold her down the river when she was genuinely trying to help him, and it caused her to be booted. When she was in danger and on the block, she literally just crumbled and didn't fight to save herself. I do think she could do well in many other seasons, and then learn from her mistakes, but she's more stable than the other pre-jurors, hence her placement here. At 8th place is Roberto from Big Brother Canada 11. His eviction is still one of the weirdest evictions I've ever seen in Big Brother Canada for sure, and while some people you can mention didn't do much wrong that caused the evictions, I really don't feel that way about Roberto. I mean, he was in a guy's alliance, and they had a plan to make relationships with others, which they were successful in, and he did have other relationships outside that alliance, which his allies were jealous about. Most of the people, including the HOH that eventually sent him home, wasn't even planning on targeting him entering week 2, or technically 3. I already mentioned how weird BBCAN 11 is with their weeks, and it was his own allies who were targeting him since Zach was a control freak, and Terrell was jealous that there was another pretty physical showman's bait in the house outside of himself. I will say that he aligned with the guys too quickly before getting to know everyone and making allies afterwards, but it's hard to see people be so stupid and petty. He did good in the few competitions he played in, had a lot of good relationships, and was picking up on how to play strategically, so I think he would do well in most cases if he were to ever return or be on other seasons. At 7th place is Latoya from BBCAN 9. I really wish I had her mentality and vibe with how to handle foolishness in my everyday life. Latoya was able to build really close bonds with several people in the house, and that's a really key component in building solid, strong alliances, which many people on the list missed out on. And I do think that Latoya gets the strategy of the game, as she get rid of the people who are not only threats, but are not working with you whatsoever, which she used to cause the Julie boot. She was in the Sunsetter Alliance, and she tried to do the same thing with booting Rohan again, but it bit her in the butt, since she handled that sloppily. I really do think that her downfall was about a lot of people being threatened that she was close with the two straight guys with black ancestry, and Victoria used that and her jealousy as reason to get her out. I will say that Latoya kind of just laid down when she was on her way out, but she definitely knew that she was the target. I do think that she could get herself into a strong alliance and maybe learn that you campaign for yourself, or you can campaign for yourself without being seen as fake, and maybe work on being better with people not in your alliance, but I do think she has a very high ceiling. At 6th place is Tanisha from BBCAN 10. Honestly, one of the main reasons why I think she ended up going early and getting a lot of flack during her season is that she came out right after Tiffany in BB2 E3, who dominated her season, and people just saw two black mothers, immediately thinking that Tanisha is as strategically skilled as Tiffany. She was able to get into a solid alliance that was the 8, and then once that split, she was a part of the Girls' Alliance and an agreement of some sorts that included most of the non-white people. While I don't think she was bad socially, and most of the house actually really liked her, she was not the social mastermind that everyone made her out to be. I don't think she was awful strategically, but I do think she was pretty mediocre strategically and had the standard strategy of making alliances. I think she needed to be more active strategically and needed to use her social relationships with people outside of her alliance more, since she just grouped herself with Summer, and arguably Betty too much, when she was not very individualistic. At 5th place is Kyle from BBCAN 10. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Zach from BBCAN 11, but as you can see, there is a discrepancy in their placements, which I will definitely get into soon. Like Zach, Kyle found himself in a powerful alliance, but he was actually in the majority of the house, which included 8 people, and he also had a side alliance with Gino, Herman, 2 people in his first alliance, JC Lynn, and Stephanie, while having good relationships with Marty and Jess as well. He set himself up really well and wasn't being pushy with his pitches and motivations, but things fell apart when he won HOH. It was a mistake for him to win HOH when he's aligned with everyone or tied to most of the house guests, and what's even worse is that he nominated all of his allies for all 3 nominations and completely blew up his alliance because he was paranoid about all the non-white people having a cut alliance, which is just a huge eye roll. And then he goes home on his closest allies HOH the very next week. He's a bit higher because, unlike Zach, he immediately realized that he made a lot of mistakes with how he played the game, and having that self-reflective trait really helps when it comes to being a BB player who performs better and better, instead of being one-dimensional, so I could see him improving if he were on other seasons. The final person in this tier overall is Jesse from BBCAN 6, who is at 4th. So he is the final person who was booted in a spot that was always going to be a Pre-Jurors spot, and the final person in this tier. I really don't think he did much wrong, like at all, to justify his boot, but Johnny really just outplayed the hell out of him. He was in the Real Deal alliance with Paris, Derek, and Kayla, while having good relationships with most of the people in the Red Room alliance, while having the basics of strategy and then dynamics down pat. You could tell that he was picking up on the game pretty quickly, but I do fault him for being extremely passive when he was on the block. He did wake up in the last 24 hours, but it was just too late, and he might have had a better chance of staying if he campaigned more earlier. They portrayed it like a huge Hamza move, who was outplaying Jesse, but that was just very inaccurate. No one in the house for the most part, even Hamza, entered that week wanting to target Jesse. I could easily see him doing relatively well on most seasons if he was randomly placed in other seasons. It is time for the mediocre tier, and these are for people who are very standard, middle of the road in general. At 3rd place is Erica from BBCAN 6. Now that we are at a point where we're discussing people who are at least decent players, it's not shocking that the remaining ones are the pre-jurors who lasted the longest, and their placement would put them as jurors in most seasons. The first and only person on this tier is Erica, and while she was screwed like the other people I've yet to talk about, I do think as a player, she's definitely the weakest. Erica is a competition beast, and it is definitely something that will benefit her in most seasons, and she was definitely a pretty good social player as well. Most of the house liked her, and she was working with half of the house, and the other half of the house wanted to work with her. She definitely has an issue with threat management, and I do think she is less than stellar strategically, as she went after people who wanted to work with her, and were absolutely no threats to her, but kept around a group of people who weren't working together and were actively targeting her. and all she did was build her own target. I do see her doing decently well on most seasons. And now we're discussing solid players, and these are the players who have more good traits than bad, but haven't shown enough to be in the top 2 tiers. And it's worth for Pre-Jurors to be here anyways. At second place is Sarah from BBCAN 2. So just based on how I ranked the house guests and the amount of time she lasted on her season, it's no shock that she's pretty much at the top of the list, in addition to 10th placers being jurors on most seasons. Of course, I'm going to mention her getting blatantly screwed with Candace HOH, and unlike Andrew, she herself was in no danger at that point to be targeted. Obviously, she was in the first 5 alliance, where she is a key member, and she also had good relationships with most of the house, as she was a part of the Girls Alliance, and even the outsiders did not mind her. While I do think that the paw move was a mistake, she recovered from it brilliantly, and it showed that she's able to clean up messes not only for herself, but for her allies. And there was her hugging Kenny once he won the veto, showing to everyone, especially Arlie, how close they were, but she was probably going up and out as a backup anyways. I feel good about her as a player and her ability to do well if she were to make it far in most seasons, or in other seasons. And at first place is Kenny. Even when I was making the BBCAN 2 game players tiers list, I was going back and forth whether he or Sarah should be higher, but I decided to put him higher, but I could easily be talked into switching them. He was very much a key and central role in the success of the first 5 alliance, and drove the strategy with Sarah and to a lesser extent Arlie the entire time. He was good in competitions from what I remembered, and a lot of the house guests did like him, so that wasn't a problem socially, though that would decrease once he glued himself to Andrew. Of course, there was him pretending to be straight so he can manipulate the woman with flirting, which, the less said, the better. Of course, he was screwed by Candace HOH, and the first 5 did have the advantage over the house at that point in the season, but Andrew was always going to be the main target. His biggest issue is the threat management, but he's definitely one of the few Pre-Jurors I can easily state is good, and his placement would put him as a juror in most seasons. So that is my rankings on the Pre-Jurors in BBCAN. It was definitely an interesting list, but it was also kind of hard to talk about so many bad players at a time. So I'm going to do the same thing with the jurors who didn't make it to the end game, which I consider to be the final 6, and then I'll make another list talking about the end gamers of BBCAN. Hopefully I'll be able to make an overall list on BBCAN players, but I don't know when that's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But of course, I'm going to talk about BB4 very soon, and I'm going to publish my BB3 tiers rankings in a few days. Take care, and I'll be with you all soon.